got the nomination, but I mean, he's had like 10 or so tweets that.
Good morning, everyone. I see we have a crowded house, which makes me very excited. There are some empty chairs, so if folks want to fill in and grab a seat if you can, so you don't have to stand through our exciting 90 jam-packed minute session of Q&A. There are some seats up front, too, so please fill in if you feel the need to. Well, welcome, everyone. We are having our Spotlight on Washington session. I'm Ann Steckel with the National Biodiesel Board. It's great to see so many of you here in D.C. today. Not in D.C., but in talking about D.C. They actually let me out of D.C. every once in a while. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about what's going on in D.C. I made a few comments yesterday in my opening comments, so this will probably be a little bit of a play-off of that. And this is really always my favorite discussion that we have the entire conference, because we bring in our experts and our consultants that we work with here at the National Biodiesel Board, and all of the folks that we have on our panel today are experts in their respective areas. And we're very lucky to call on them and have them as consultants, and it's really a big part of the NBB team to help us out in Washington. It's certainly an exciting time in D.C. with the inauguration coming this Friday. And so with that, why don't I go ahead and bring our folks up on the stage to begin our panel discussion. You'll see on the monitors, we urge you guys to text in any questions you may have for our group. We really want this to be a free-flowing discussion. I know many of you have stopped me in the hallway with a lot of exciting questions about what's going to happen with the RFS, what's going to happen with the tax credit, and deeper questions with those issue areas. So please make sure you text those questions, and we will answer all the questions that we have time for. So thank you guys so much for coming. So with that, let's bring our first panelist up to the stage, former Senator Byron Dorgan. Senator Dorgan hails from the state of North Dakota, and Senator Dorgan is such a great asset for us, obviously, having been in Congress for several years, both the House and the Senate, and now working with us here at the National Biodiesel Board. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And our next panelist is former Congressman Kenny Hulshof. And Kenny was a congressman in Missouri and has been a long-term proponent of biodiesel. And if you guys remember when the biodiesel tax incentive was first initiated, he was a leader on that. So he is an integral part of our team and helps us out with tax and energy issues. Thank you so much, Kenny.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you. Good morning.
And our next panelist is Tim Urban. Tim is from Washington Counsel Ernst & Young, and Tim is our tax guru. And in today's day and age, we're talking about tax reform and tax extenders a lot, so we often call on Tim to help us out with tax issues. So thanks for joining us, Tim. And our next panelist is Jim Massie from Massie & Associates, and Jim has been a long-term face on Capitol Hill, having worked for several members of Congress, and has a very deep knowledge of the goings-on in the energy sector and certainly the RFS. And so as we talk a lot about what may or may not happen with RFS reform, Jim is a real big help to us with that. So thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
And then our final panelist today is Tom Hance with Gorley & Associates. And many of you know Tom. He's been a familiar face here at NBB as a long-term consultant of ours. Helps us out with a lot of agriculture issues. We're going to be talking a little bit about a farm bill. Maybe we're actually going to be doing another farm bill. So Tom's been able to really help us out with those issues as well as tax and energy. So thank you so much, Tom. So here we are, and we just had a huge election, and I think we're all trying to wrap our heads around what that election means. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of uncertainty. I think we all try to follow what's going on with Trump and Twitter, which seems to be the best way to get information these days from the president. But why don't you all take a few minutes and talk to the group about your impressions of the election, where do we go from here, and how does that maybe affect our industry? Senator?
I don't know. Actually.
Good night, everybody.
You know, my head's still kind of exploding. This is a really interesting time in our country's political life, and the fact is, Kenny and I were talking about what we might have predicted the last time we spoke on this stage. We don't want to go back and review that, but I don't think any of us expected the result that occurred on election night. Because it did occur, we want our country to do well. I mean, my hope is this new president is a success. My hope is that he does well for our country. All of us feel that way. Now, the question of what's going to happen, what's the playbook, what happens next, Lord only knows. I don't have the foggiest idea. We've never had a president that before he gets out of bed, gets his phone and starts tweeting. You know, he's changing the rules some and surprising people in the Democratic Party, people in the Republican Party. So we don't know where all this heads. But again, we want it to go well for our country. Now, with respect to biodiesel, let me just say this. We wrote the RFS 12 years ago. It has existed for some long while, and the fact is, you sat on the seat with this magazine, and it's a great front cover, right? Biodiesel Renaissance. I mean, it's upbeat, and it talks about what you've built, what we've built in this country, and we should be proud of it. This is a very strong success story. The fact is, Donald Trump likes success. He talks about it a lot: the biggest, the best, the greatest, the most, right? Well, look, if he wants to embrace success, my hope is he'll take a look at what you have done, what we have done in rural areas, creating jobs and economic expansion, and building and creating a biofuels industry that is very significant for our country and provides major advantages for our country. So my hope is that he will recognize this and be a booster of something that's so important to our country. One final point. We need to make sure that the RFS continues to give us boosted opportunity, and we hope that'll come from this administration. He, after all, did go through Iowa in this process of getting elected. Number two, there likely will be a tax bill. We'll talk a lot about that, and we need to be a part of that tax bill. The tax incentive that exists, we want to change it to a producer tax credit. But so we need to be a part of watching the RFS, the mandate, watching what the states are doing, trying to keep the RFS mandate at the federal level, be in the tax bill in a positive way for biodiesel. And I feel pretty upbeat. You know what? We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we're going to help make happen what we want to have happen if we all work hard. Thank you very much.
Great. Very good. Who was at our gathering a year ago? Byron mentioned, with the bold predictions that we made. Normally speakers like to try to enhance their credibility, and not detract. But, in order of sequence, I was for the Kansas City Chiefs, the Alabama Crimson Tide, the Golden State Warriors against Cleveland, and I was a John Kasich supporter. So, but Byron is right. This is something we've never seen before. Maybe the tweet is the old fireside chat of
real short.
Yeah, that's right. 140 characters. When I was before I was in Congress, I prosecuted murder cases in the state of Missouri, and I would often start with a jury pool like this and say that a trial is like a best-selling novel, and the chapters will be filled with the witness statements, and here's what the story will tell you. And as a prosecutor, of course, fire and brimstone and all of those things. And at the end of that trial, I would tell the jury members, we've reached the last chapter of the best-selling novel, but it hasn't been written yet. And so here's the pen, and it's time for you, the jury, to write an ending that society will support. And in one instance, I had a juror actually scoop up my pen and head out into the jury room, and I told the investigator, I think we're okay on this one. Here's the thing. This is going to be a novel, and it is not yet written. I mean, we are hanging on every word, aren't we, from the nominees? I mean, probably you saw across your phone today, right? EPA nominee under questioning of Senator Deb Fischer from Nebraska, who said, as far as the RFS is concerned, it is the EPA's job to, quote, honor the intent of Congress. And so we feel good, don't we, that nominee Pruitt didn't come out, with some incendiary statement against the renewable fuel standard. And so we're hanging on essentially every word, every tweet. But I think a couple of things. We often, all of us, because of our longevity around Washington, we often try to find some time in history, recent history, that we can compare to. And for those of you, and I know Byron was there, I ran for office in 1994 unsuccessfully. It ran again in 1996. But you remember in 1992, President Bill Clinton, who charmed the country at the time, this unique, drawl governor, amiable, playing a saxophone on television, who dominated the political culture from 1993 and 4, and then what happened? Well, Congress flipped, and then suddenly the presidency wasn't as relevant, and then suddenly Congress became very relevant. I sense that, while we will look at the tweets and, see what the White House has to say, I really think Congress has become extremely relevant on issues that address our industry. And we'll talk about those in some detail, but the future of the RFS, if the EPA nominee is telling us he's going to honor the intent of Congress, well, guess what? The ball then is squarely in the halls of Congress. And thankfully, we are not Johnny-come-latelys to any of these issues, whether it's on tax reform, whether it's the RFS. We have done the spade work, if you will, for years and years, and we are in a good place. Yes, there is tons of uncertainty. The tax credit is gone. What shall it be replaced with? Will it be replaced? What is the future of the RFS? Again, the last chapter, or the chapter of that book is yet to be written. You and I and all of us are going to help write that chapter, and I look forward to the discussion this morning. Mr. Urban.
Wow. Good morning. My purpose here is to make some comments with regard to tax reform. And I guess, first of all, I'd just like to say that Ernst & Young continues to be honored to be invited to participate in events like this with a panel so prestigious. This year, for tax nerds, this year is, kind of potentially a Super Bowl. The last, major tax reform act was 1986. Since then, the Congress and the various presidents have been playing kind of small ball tax bills, very limited, very discreet in their scope. NBB has traditionally been seen as one of the smaller, but one of the most potent trade associations in Washington. NBB has traditionally done very well with the tax writing committees and has generally been associated with tax incentives that are the envy of most of the other energy companies out there and trade associations. So when we look ahead into 2017, I just want to give you a little bit of Ernst & Young's point of view and possibly provide some statements that other speakers can comment on. This year, obviously, is fundamentally different than many previous years in that you have the White House is going to be controlled by a Republican. The majority of the House of Representatives and majority of the Senate will be controlled by Republicans. And that provides an opportunity for them to move legislation in a way that was, frankly, not really at anyone's disposal with the conflict between President Obama and Congress in previous years. So the second important point is that there are congressional processes that would allow the leaders of the House and Senate to move legislation without the 60 votes necessary to overcome a filibuster. These rules have to do, they're called budget reconciliation rules, and they're somewhat arcane and complicated, but it's just important to know that these guys kind of have what it takes to potentially move some, if not all, of these legislative proposals they're known as tax reform under a budget reconciliation process. And, thirdly, I think that you've got those two dynamics going on, and you've got a president that campaigned on a platform where his two highest legislative agenda items had to do with repealing Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and moving fundamental tax reform. Those agenda items are virtually identical to the large macro agenda of the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, of the Senate Majority Leader, of the Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and the Chairman of the Finance Committee. So if you take those 3 points and you sort of stir them together, it seems that it's extremely likely that tax reform will be debated and probably pass the House and move probably through the Finance Committee and possibly even be enacted this year. We don't know. Are there a lot of potential events along the way and possibly even impediments? Yes, and I think we'll get to them. One thing I'd like to point out is that everything I've talked about so far is sort of predicated upon using this budget reconciliation procedure, which really won't be available to the House and the Senate until they finish their deliberations on the repeal of Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. That debate is possibly getting more complicated, I think, every day rather than less complicated. So I would caution everyone in the audience that for those of you who have been up on Capitol Hill within the last 3 or 4 months and met with Republican members of Congress and been assured that this will all be done by March or April, I think that may be a little bit of an optimistic viewpoint. But as we move forward, and I'll give up the floor here in just a second, I guess we always talk about the P's when we analyze what's going on in Washington. We talk about the policy issues, we talk about the politics, we talk about the procedural rules, and we talk about the personalities. And I think all 4 of those P's will be equally important in different degrees as we move forward on tax reform. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here today. I want to sort of back up and start where Kenny and Byron were, and that is a little bit about the president. Let me try to give you a little bit of insight. So I've been doing a couple speeches like this the last couple months, trying to give the audience a little perspective. And so just before each one of these speeches, I actually call friends of mine that are part of the Trump transition team and say, give me some insight. Talk to me a little bit about what it's like to work for the boss, what the new administration is going to be like, because that's really part of what drives this fabulous crowd we have today. The first thing that I'm reminded about is that whether it's clear or not, the president believes that Washington is an insider's city, that we're all best of friends, we all work together, we hire each other's sons and daughters, and that we're the last people to fix things that are broken. And so when you heard the president talk about, drain the swamp, that's really what he was talking about, is he feels like if you're going to be a change agent, you can't, 1, need a job after you're done in Washington, or 2, have been part of the process in Washington the last few years. So that's an important element. And so when you look at his cabinet selections, they match up almost in line with that, and that they are billionaires and millionaires. They do not need another job. And they are not beholden to any constituency groups generally in Washington, D.C. So what you're seeing is he's assembled a team that he's developed a very clear, overarching message. And so the next thing I said to friends that I've talked to that are part of the transition team, and we all know people that are part of this, they said, so tell me what these interviews are like that when he makes a decision. And they said there's basically 3 elements to the interview with a nominee. Do we have chemistry? Do I like you? Do you think well? Do we kind of get along? Number 2, am I clear? You're going to do what I ask you and tell you are my policies. And number 3, you do understand I'll fire you if you don't do what I want to have occur. And that's very simply what the meeting's all about. As a matter of fact, you saw early in the nominating process, meetings that lasted 30 minutes to an hour, and a nomination occurred literally a day or that afternoon. So you have to think about it. The president is what you saw, both in the election, but just as much as you saw on television. He's a man who makes his mind up, and he's made his mind up, and he's moved on. So the other thing I'll think about is I want to remind you that I think it was Byron that brought it up. The reason the president's sitting in office is you, our farmers, and our ethanol colleagues. And it's because we delivered the extra votes that pulled them over the finish line in the key 3 or 4 states that actually were the difference in this election. But I think more importantly, he knows that. And what he knows is what he saw when he went out and met with you all in Iowa, Michigan, and Wisconsin. He saw some revitalization in rural America he didn't know existed. That's, if you live in New York, you would know what's going on out in the nice big square flyover states. But the other thing is that he also saw a rebirth of the economy in rural America that he didn't know was going on either. Our point is to keep that front and center on his mind so that he doesn't forget us, because that's going to be the key to us retaining the RFS and for us finding the successor to the tax code. And let me stop there and let me turn it over to Tom.
Thank you, Jim.
it is a fascinating time in Washington, as many of the panelists have alluded to. The range of outcomes and possibilities are so broad and the dynamics so different that almost anything we could say up here today wouldn't seem outlandish in terms of what could happen this year going forward. Jim talked about the insights that you can gain from the cabinet nominees that President-elect Trump has selected thus far. I think you can also gain some insight into the cabinet nominee that he hasn't named and the process and what has played out in the absence of an Ag USDA Secretary nominee. And what you're seeing is, and by all accounts, President-elect Trump, he has no formal structure. He relishes in having competing interests within his team and his apparatus vying and each competing to have their voices and their perspective win out. And ultimately, the only one that knows the outcome and the only one that will make the decision is him. And that's why we're seeing a lot of media speculation and industry speculation and different names coming forth throughout the last few weeks, and yet none of them have thus far proven accurate as to who that selection will be. So it will be a very, I think, disaggregated process, again, with not a lot of formal structure to it, and ultimately one decision maker.
Well, that's some good insights for what we can kind of expect. There's been a lot of talk about the nominees, and some of you touched on this. With the diversity of the folks that have been nominated and are starting to go through the confirmation process, how do we as an industry best position ourselves to ensure that we have the RFS continue the way it is, we continue to get support on the tax reform? What can we do as an industry in working with this new administration to get our issues front and center? Kenny, you want to start off?
Sure. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. And so what I see in this is an opportunity. We have a blank slate. I mean, there are a couple of hard and fast positions that the president-elect has taken. Building the wall, paying for it, who's going to pay for it. But in a lot of other instances, I think I like the CEO, the scenario you described, Jim, and that is he will hear contrary points of view and ultimately then make the decision. That is a great opportunity for us because if you're talking about growing the economy, if you look at that red-blue map, that I guess from really 2000 was the first year we started looking at the red jerseys and the blue jerseys. If you look at the swath of the country, especially the strong rural areas, that makes up that red area, the renaissance of rural America has to be front and center as far as your president-elect is concerned. Thankfully, we continue to have the strong champions that we've all been working with on Capitol Hill. To those of you in Iowa, thank you for giving us Chuck Grassley back. In Missouri, Roy Blunt has been a great supporter of biodiesel. We have fresh faces, though, too, don't we? So we have to continue to educate, tell our story, advocate. I found it interesting that, again, as we peruse the headlines, especially as it relates to tax reform, that the CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, that doesn't see eye to eye necessarily with us, I'm being kind, said we've got to make sure that Congress in this tax reform, they understand what the oil and gas industry, what is necessary for us. So in a sense, we're all starting from the same starting line, and we have some good, strong champions, whether it's on the renewable fuel standard, whether it's obviously on the tax side, and then, though, we have to help educate those brand new, fresh faces that are ultimately. I mean, we've got 4 new folks on the Ways and Means Committee, for instance, and so part of our task on your behalf is to educate them, to tell the story of biodiesel, and so that's again, that's the blocking and tackling that has to go into ultimately being successful.
Yeah, I mean, we have lived now for a while with substantial change. We went from scarcity to abundance in energy. We went down a road believing finally that there's something happening with respect to climate change that we had to deal with in terms of creating a lower carbon future. So all of that has kind of been accepted now, and we're trying to adjust to that. This morning I was watching Mr. Pruitt, who is nominated to be the head of EPA, and he was being questioned, and I forget who was questioning him, but they said that President-elect Trump said on the campaign trail that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. They said to Mr. Pruitt, "Do you believe that climate change is a hoax?" Mr. Pruitt said, "I do not believe it's a hoax." So I'm thinking, I don't know whether they're going to fire him this morning or not. But so I don't know what that means. I just don't. I assume that there was discussion with the Trump folks before Mr. Pruitt went before the Congress, knowing he would be asked that question. The point is, I think that we should approach all of this as, yes, an opportunity, but understand the cold reality of a challenge as well. Because if it's a Mr. Pruitt that worked in Oklahoma, that's a different kind of Mr. Pruitt in terms of our interests. If it's a Mr. Pruitt who is before the Congress today saying that he believes climate change exists, almost inevitably, we will all have to come together to say we need a lower carbon future. Now, that's where we come in, right? I mean, the advantage of biodiesel is, number one, fuel diversity. Even in abundance, you need diversity of fuel supplies. And so we're there. Second, the lower carbon output from using biodiesel is unbelievable. This is a huge advantage. And it again, as I said, for everyone in the Trump administration, they need to understand what Jim just talked about. When you go out to these rural states and see what your investment has done in putting some concrete and some businesses together and producing biodiesel, it is jobs, it is expansion, it's a brighter future. If this administration understands that, I hope they'll embrace it and want to brand it as their own. They should. I hope they would. And all of us can work to try to make that happen.
I would say one of the great things about the biodiesel industry is the plethora of benefits that we provide, and certainly will target our messages to the audience. And this audience, I think, will be more responsive to those benefits that Byron just alluded to on the economics, on the jobs, the hard hat workers, the investments, the steel that's been put in the ground. And so those are things that we can accentuate with this administration, and we have a great story to tell on that front as well.
Let me back up to the RFS for a moment. First off, as we all appreciate and have read, Carl Icahn has some fairly strong opinions about what needs to be done to the RFS. And when you talk to our friends that are currently working for the president-elect, Icahn's voice is really beginning to resonate in the president-elect's office and suite. We're going to be challenged, whether it's the RVO or for 2018 and 19, we're going to be challenged in numerous ways by this EPA. So the first thing we're going to have to do is to make sure we have strong relationships within EPA and the administrator's office and with Mr. Grundler and the rest of the EPA team as far as what biodiesel needs to continue to grow the future. I don't view the president as going back or potentially going back on his pledge to us about what he feels about the RFS, but I view there's a lot of wiggle room or air between what he said and what he will instruct EPA to do. So I think we have to be vigilant and aggressive if we're to make sure we hold his feet to the fire and make sure that we get growth in the future. At the same time, we have a tremendous number of challenges with the House and Senate both being in Republican hands this time. As we all know, there's a new chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Greg Walden from Oregon, who I think will be a very fair and very good chairman, but who supports reforming the RFS and who's been a fan of basically freezing corn ethanol. And the problem with that is he's not really addressed what to do with biodiesel. And when you start to ask his staff and his team, their response is fairly simple. Well, biodiesel's fine. My response very quickly back is, well, where's the growth? We're not fine if there's not a future. When you look at the Senate and the Senate Environment Public Works Committee that has jurisdiction over the RFS, The new chairman, Barrasso from Wyoming, is an opponent of the RFS. He was for repeal. So if we look at our challenges on Capitol Hill of the RFS, they probably got a little bit more, a risk level went up a little bit. I still think that we've got the right team to keep and grow in RFS, both on Capitol Hill and within the agency. But I think, we're going to have to redouble our efforts in 2017. So,
And I guess just to follow up, there will be a yellow legal pad behind the podium after the event to take a list of any of you who regularly play golf at Mar-a-Lago. Because I understand that is an excellent way of communicating with the president-elect. For those of us that don't regularly have that access.
is that a short legal pad or a long legal pad?
I'm hoping a long one. But for those of us who don't have that kind of access, I think that NBB has already identified the members of the House and Senate who are champions of biodiesel and rural issues and farm issues as one of our next best tools in the debate. Because for those of you who are students of the legislative process, especially the tax legislative process, you'll know that it goes through an almost guaranteed evolution. And it starts out at an academic level, being instigated and authored by tax law professors and PhD economists and treasury officials.
People like you.
No. But then it immediately goes into the meat grinder that we know as the legislative process, and that tends to inject a certain amount of chaos. For those of you who follow Game of Thrones, chaos is a ladder. There are opportunities that are available to all of us via our members of Congress and senators who will have a say. And importantly, I think these are members of both the Republican and Democrat allegiance. And so we should not, I think, overlook the opportunities that are available to us. The tax reform is always a dangerous game. And the reason it's a dangerous game is because the legislation that the House and Senate will look at this year potentially changes the tax effect on virtually every part of our economy. Individuals, pass-throughs, partnerships, MLPs, corporations, U.S. multinationals, inbound foreign companies. Because there are all those different players at the table, there will be a tremendous amount of competition for the attention of these members and senators. And so, although NBB has traditionally been one of the more effective players in Washington, I think that this year will put a lot of pressure on Ann and the D.C. office and all of you to sort of bring our game up to the next level and try to compete and win the attention of our champions to make sure that the industry's needs are addressed. Ann.
Thanks, guys. Just a follow-up comment. Tim, you've talked a lot about tax reform, and we've heard a lot about tax reform. Kenny, you were a member of the Ways and Means Committee and dealt with taxes for a good amount of your time in Congress. How do you see tax reform coming through? It seems like there's a lot more chatter about it moving quickly in the House than there is the Senate. How do they reconcile that, and what's the game as you see it?
You want to take it first?
It's your question.
Well, the last, as Tim referenced in the opening, the last major tax reform Byron had a hand in back in 1986, and fascinating political story, backstories. I think the tax code today is substantially more complicated than it was in 1986, and so it's mind-boggling. That's why we have really smart people like Tim to figure out, some of the, if you push over here, then something else pops up. And so it really is going to be a challenge. I do think there is the political will, not just the political will. I think, Kevin Brady, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, we were elected together, and I told him candidly recently, I said, there are many, many, many things about Congress that I don't miss, but right now it is the Super Bowl if you are interested in fundamentally changing the way that we raise revenue in this country. And he's up to the challenge. The chairman, as well as over on the Senate side, we got a little bit of an insight, and we shared with some of you, I think in St. Louis in November, that were at the board meeting. A week before the election, on November 1st, in BB, we had a political event for the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in Houston. And initially, I think we were scheduled to have maybe an hour of his time. Well, the lunch extended to a 2-hour period of time. And he heard from all of us as far as the RFS, as far as imports are concerned, why we were still hopeful that in the waning days of Congress that we might see the blender's credit move to be amended, reformed to a producer's credit. And then he came back at us with this scenario, and I will yield to those of you who maybe remember because I was sitting right next to him. He said, what if, he was already thinking ahead, what if we had fundamental tax reform where the rates that your producers are going to pay was 20%, it was border adjusted, which would take care of this import problem, and so he put forth this hypothetical thinking about what potentially could be, and it really gave us pause because we've been thinking, bless you, we've been thinking about the credit and extension and reforming and tweaking, and so I think one of our challenges through all of this exercise is we're going to have to think of in a much larger sense about where we want the industry to be and how can we help make that become a reality.
And we've gotten a lot of questions about the tax credit. Again, if you have any other questions, tax or other issues related, make sure you text those and we will answer them as best we can. So a follow-up question on the tax credit, Tim, you may want to take this. If we were successful in changing the tax credit from a blender's tax credit to a producer's tax credit, will there be some sort of phase-in? How will that be administered? Will that allow time for the industry to adjust? How would that be dealt with?
Well, thanks, Ann. I mean, customarily, when something like this, which would be a significant change in federal tax policy, customarily at the point when the Congress is consummating some sort of a conference agreement on a package like that, they would reach out to the affected stakeholders, in this case, the trade association, and have a dialogue about what would be necessary to segue from one regime to another. For those of you who remember what happened to the tax code after the 86 Act, there were hundreds of different rules that provided transition from one old regime to a new regime. And I think especially in the case of biodiesel, where we've already noticed that there are certain sectors and segments that need to be sensitivity with regard to the business practices and give people time, it would be normal for them to consult with NBB, and it would be normal for there to be some sort of transition.
That's helpful, thank you. Another follow-up tax credit question. What is the potential of attaching the producer's tax credit to the Farm Bill, giving the industry a 5-year deal? Tom, you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I think with, as Tim's alluded and the others, the magnitude of agenda items, starting with the Obamacare, tax reform. Later in the year, we're going to get into some budget issues, the debt ceiling, potentially doing tax reform through a second budget reconciliation. All of that's going to take up a lot of oxygen and resources and energy. So a farm bill this year, while there are a lot of external factors that motivate farm bill stakeholders to push for and seek action on a new farm bill, the current one doesn't expire until 2018. Recent history in Congress suggests that they are not typically proactive in writing new reauthorization legislation. They, in fact, have been tardy on many of the major authorization bills, having to pass extensions of the current bill while they work overtime to get a new bill written and secure the votes to get it enacted. So I think the focus is going to be on comprehensive tax reform. The challenges are going to be greater this year. To give some more perspective on that, the biodiesel tax credit in years past has been addressed in a tax extenders vehicle. That is a universe of less than 50 tax credit provisions that are smaller in magnitude that impact industries like biodiesel. With comprehensive tax reform, as Tim discussed, you're talking about major impacts on the national economy and globally. It's going to make it very challenging to create leverage and to get our voices heard and to break through and have members of Congress understand the consequences to our industry. So I think we're all going to be focused on tax reform, and after that plays out later in the year, certainly other vehicles will be we'll look at and try to, as best as we can, to attach it wherever we can.
And a little bit of a follow-up question to what you just answered, Tom. Has the biodiesel tax credit been separated from the existing tax credit extension? If so, why? What does that mean for the future? I think, Tim, if you want to take a stab at this.
Yeah. On December 31st of last year, 36 temporary tax provisions expired. The Joint Committee on Taxation will continue to publish pamphlets identifying the expiring and expired provisions into the future. But unlike previous years, I think that the chairman of the Finance and Ways and Means Committee have made it pretty clear to their members and to the bigger conferences that they would like to address these quote-unquote extender issues as part of the bigger discussion in tax reform. Now, the one thing you learn in Washington is you never say never. If for some reason tax reform, if the debate appears to be cratering or becoming extremely slowed down, I think there would be a clamor from NBB and dozens of other groups to say something to the effect of, now that tax reform is not a guaranteed outcome for 2017, that the Congress has a responsibility to do at least something as a bridge for groups like the biodiesel industry. Until that time, it looks like tax reform could be enacted. But I think right now it's very early in the process. We don't have a Treasury Secretary. We don't have an Assistant Treasury Secretary for tax policy. We don't have an administration budget. So I think that right now, people like Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, Kevin Brady, the chairman of the committee, the Senate Majority Leader, they're all, at this point, asking that all these smaller tax issues like the extenders tax issues be debated within the context of tax reform, in the context of that being an issue that's going to move this year.
Let me just make the point that what the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee would like doesn't always happen. I mean, it's not as if that every year for the last 10 or 15 years there has been a desire to do tax reform. Let me just ask a question, if we can see a show of hands. How many of you think our tax code should be reformed?
Everybody here.
Yeah, most everybody. And it's been that way for a long time. So there's tremendous popular support for saying, let's do tax reform. It is much more complicated to actually do. And I'll give you an example. When you talked about reconciliation, they're going to use reconciliation, budget reconciliation, in order to do tax reform. But in order to do that, first you have to agree on a budget. Now, last year, the Republicans controlled the House and the Senate, but didn't have a budget because they couldn't agree on one. Just couldn't. I don't know whether they can agree on one this year. If they can get reconciliation capabilities. If they can't, there's no such thing as reconciliation. The first, and I just mentioned quickly, the first decision will have to be made by Ways and Means and Finance. Will this be corporate tax reform only? Some are pushing for that very hard, saying, you can do that, you must do that. Others say, you can't do corporate tax reform without doing individual tax reform. How on earth do you explain that to the American people? So those are just a few of the complications. It's very hard to do. And I would just say that at the end of the year, there's probably about as much likelihood of an attempt to pass an extenders package as there is to have seen a major tax reform bill. It may be about 50-50 because it's very hard to do major tax reform. But it's worth doing if you can get it done right.
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us. a play off of what we've been talking about with the tax issues, and something that you guys may be hearing a lot about in the press, is this border adjustability. It says a tax blueprint being floated by Speaker Ryan and others. Within it is a border adjustment tax, which would essentially be a tariff on imported goods. How would a tax change like this affect biodiesel imports?
We all look to you.
Ann's managed to put her finger on one of the most controversial issues associated with the House tax reform blueprint. And I will preface my remarks by saying that if you read the Better Way plan, which is available on the internet from the House Republicans, the description of the border adjustability process is actually just a prose language, very brief discussion. It's not in statutory language.
Not that much.
So some of my comments will be actually referring to the description in the Better Way plan, and some of them will be from conversations we've had with staff and some things we've inferred from the documents. According to the House plan, they need basically $1 trillion to make the plan, not revenue neutral, but not a huge revenue loser. They also are trying to stop what are called inversions, where U.S. based companies choose to move their headquarters overseas to avoid U.S. income tax, and also to take advantage of more favorable tax regimes in other countries. So the idea of border adjustability is to put the U.S. supposedly on either an even playing field with our sort of first world trading partners, or even to possibly give them somewhat of an advantage, while making our law still defensible under our World Trade Organization trade commitments. Now, the idea is that we are not going to adopt a value-added tax, a VAT, which is what virtually everyone else in the first world has, for political reasons and for other reasons, but we're seeking to sort of emulate the effects of what a VAT does. So U.S. exports would not be subject to U.S. corporate income tax. U.S. imports would be subject to tax treatment that would make it less favorable. So for instance, if you are a U.S.-based biodiesel manufacturer and you purchase the raw materials for making the biodiesel from a local U.S. supplier, you would make the biodiesel, you would sell it, and then after you get your income from selling the biodiesel, you would subtract from that amount the cost of the goods that you purchased as raw materials. Now, if you have a competitor a couple miles down the road also making biodiesel, and they choose to save a little bit by buying some imported feedstock, they would also sell their finished product. They would receive payment for that, but they would not be able to deduct from their income any amount they paid for the imported feedstock. So, that would, on its face, seem to provide a pretty significant economic difference. But I will add that a number of economics professors have suggested that over a long period of time, the rising value of the U.S. dollar will somehow affect, this transaction. Now,
Levelize all that.
yeah. Now, I got to tell you, I think that I've been privy to a number of economic papers and pursuits, and it's interesting because really what it comes down to is that for companies that rely on imports, those that don't go bankrupt in the first 7 to 10 years may eventually benefit from the increasing strength of the U.S. dollar. But it does seem to me that, at least the data I've seen, is that in the short term, U.S. manufacturers that use U.S. feedstocks would be substantially advantaged. U.S. manufacturers that use imported feedstocks would be disadvantaged. Also, Anna, I would just point out that one other complementary dynamic of the U.S. House blueprint is that it contains a provision that would allow 100% expensing in the first year of business assets, other than land. Land apparently is not depreciable, so therefore it wouldn't be subject to expensing. But what is not mentioned in the House GOP document, but what we understand, is that you would not be eligible to expense any of those assets that are imported.
So if I can interrupt, please, and ask Tim to add on. So as we talk about the president, his incoming administration, I've noticed in the last couple days he has started to criticize the border adjustment tax, and he prefers something simpler, sort of a tariff. Can you square that with what the Ways and Means Committee's done, and can you speculate as far as what we should at least think about?
Yeah. Well, great question, and certainly one for which there's not a concrete answer. There is a tremendous struggle going on in Washington as we speak between some fairly titanic forces, some that really want this border adjustability provision to be enacted, and others that equally vehemently are opposed to border adjustability. And the way this struggle is sort of playing out is that champions from both sides are working the ref, or the refs, who are the most senior advisors to the president-elect. There have been comments from some of the most senior advisors, some of whom are friends of yours, Senator Dorgan, who have said that actually the House border adjustability proposal mimics, to a certain degree, proposals that the president-elect made during the campaign. Now, tariffs, I think we all agree here that the House leadership and maybe the Senate Republican leadership as well have been pretty vehement about their unwillingness to pass additional tariffs. But this border adjustability proposal in some ways mimics the effect of a tariff.
Right.
So there have been some Trump advisors who have come out and said that in the end, they thought the president-elect would end up seeing how the border adjustability proposal creates economic effects that are very similar to those that he campaigned for. On the other hand, as Jim points out, as recently as yesterday, in a very sort of ad hoc interview, the president-elect expressed some reservations because he thought that if in any way the border adjustments were to be adjusted in a way that were disadvantageous for U.S. consumers, that would be bad. And clearly, any of you who are wearing men's suits these days, or even women's clothing as well, a lot of products in the U.S. are imported. And there are certain industries that are virtually 99% dependent upon imports. So, and it's certainly not going to be an easy resolution. And I guess the one thing I just had is that the $1 trillion number is very important. The $1 trillion revenue estimate has been attached. I think personally, I think if the Ways and Means Committee and the House leadership want to get this package through the House in a timely fashion, it will be very difficult to take that one card out of the House of Cards, pull it out of the middle, and Kenny, you probably have thoughts too.
Well, just to that point. So if the Wall Street Journal article, was it yesterday or day before, just on this, and it's a pretty good layperson summary. I understood it. So about this whole border adjustment. And so let me underscore a couple of points Tim has made. Both House and Senate Republicans have said, we want this to be tax revenue neutral. In other words, and here's a misnomer. I know it comes across the internet, and everything on the internet's not necessarily true. I don't know if you knew that or not. Tax cuts do not pay for themselves. I would often in a town meeting say, well, you cut taxes and it's going to pay for itself. It doesn't. It does create some dynamic things that happen in the economy. When you cut the capital gains tax rate, you see a lot of activity and more revenues coming in. But the revenues coming in don't match the amount of reductions in revenue. So this $1 trillion is a big deal. It's a deal because the House Republicans, Senate Republicans need this revenue so they can cut our tax rates. And so this is huge. I mean, it is the underpinning of fundamental tax reform as far as the legislature is concerned. So the president-elect says this is too complicated. And, again, Tim has done a great job, and we're still kind of like, what? And so it's a tough issue. But, and the 4 Ps he talked about, the policy, the P of politics of this is gargantuan. I mean, if you want to see, gladiators to the nth degree here, because I'll be a little Trump-like and not mentioned by name, but let's say, for instance, if you have an international company that's headquartered in, I don't know, Arkansas, Bentonville, and you got a big bunch of box stores around the world, and a lot of your goods on your shelves are coming from some other country, you don't like border adjustment because you don't get to write off the cost of those goods. Your inventory is coming in from some other country. Guess what? You have a huge tax disadvantage because you're bringing in those goods from some foreign land. Do you think that they're going to shrug and say, whatever? I mean, this is going to be a pitched battle. Now, and here's my bold prediction for today, and if we all get together a year from now, you can wag your finger and say, you missed this again, Hulshof. If at the end of the day, if the Republican version has border adjustment in tax reform, I do not believe the President of the United States, he is not going to veto tax reform because of this one issue. There are going to be a ton of issues like this one. And I have no insider, I don't play golf, so I haven't been with the President-elect. But I think if it survives, if border adjustment survives the end of this long process, then I don't think the President's going to veto this fundamental reform because of this one issue. Obviously, they will have input along the way, but the politics of this are going to be big, huge, right? Huge.
And for the record, for everyone who says that believes that all of us in Washington are out of touch, we do acknowledge that $1 trillion is a big deal.
That's right. Let me just add a comment on the $1 trillion is an attempt to raise money in order to drive down the rates, as Kenny just said. If you can collect this money, you can then drive down the tax rate. But in every tax reform effort, there are winners and losers. Most of the winners will, if people know who wins and loses, will raise their hand and say, we're for it. Losers are not quite so interested. And let me just bring this home. You didn't mention Walmart, but in a chapter of one of my books, I have a chapter titled Walmart and China Dancing in the Dark, in which I describe trade between our two countries, and particularly with Walmart. The fact is, Walmart is a very large merchandiser in our country and very, very successful. And they will make the point in an extraordinarily aggressive way that the loser here is going to be the customer at Walmart because they're going to pay the freight. And so bring in Walmart and a lot of other interests, similar interests, and then add the Koch brothers, not exactly people that you want to ignore, right, who've come out strongly in opposition, and you have this titanic struggle. My view is if it ever got to the President's desk, he would sign it with border adjustment. I think it's very problematic that it would ever get to the President's desk. I think the House can probably, and not certainly, but can probably lace something up in a kind of a bundle and get what they want through the House. It is much, much, much more difficult to get something like this through the Senate. The politics of it are incendiary.
Well, let's switch up a little bit. I've gotten a couple of questions here from folks about the point of obligation. And we've all been reading about and hearing a lot about what may happen with changing the point of obligation. There have been a couple of big names that have come out in support of changing it, and then there's been some other folks that have come out and said that they don't want to change the point of obligation. What do you all think is going to happen? Obviously, the Trump administration, with some of the advisors that they are naming, think this is an important issue. How do you guys see that playing out?
You start. Mr. Massie.
I think, first off, I think you have to step back and appreciate that what you just said, the question is accurate. With Carl Icahn, with Delta, with Valero, and several others of the refiners wanting to move the point of obligation because the cost of RINs have started to become a measurable amount. I think Valero's lobbyist last fall said it was over $50 million a year. I think that's what they have said publicly. That has been a lot of pressure, and they have a very loud voice in the President-elect's office. I think this issue is going to play out in two ways. First off, I think it's going to play out in the Administrator of EPA Pruitt's office as far as what to do about the point of obligation. His problem is going to be is that the lawyers inside the Office of Air pretty much sort of tied his hands on what he can do with the point of obligation. I don't know how much you're paying attention to how they handled dealing with the question they raised about the point of obligation, but the way they built the record on it is they sort of tainted the record as far as it's the wrong thing to do from a policy perspective. So for Pruitt to do something, he's got to sort of unwind that record that has been created within the EPA. That doesn't mean he can't, but what that does is it takes time. And if I understand it correctly, the refiners want immediate change, and they're hoping that they get that out of the new president and his team. So that means you're sort of looking at Capitol Hill. And right now, the point of obligation and the refiners are in sort of a disagreement with API and its members because their view is that they're having a basic disagreement of do we want repeal this year instead of reform? And point of obligation is second or third layer of the conversation between the oil companies and the refiners at this very second. So, and when you crack open API's members, some of API's members are actually doing quite well with the current point of obligation because they've figured out the market and they've figured out how to make money in it. So this is not an easy, simple, quick thing to discuss or address. What I really believe happens is I would anticipate that the administrator tries to address the point of obligation and tries to recommend that it be done in the proposed RVO this year. I think he's going to get a lot of resistance, but I think that's what he's going to try to do is try to appease some of the president's allies and advocates. I don't really know what the outcome of that is because when I look at the people that have lined up against it, it's a pretty formidable group of people. I think I noticed today that the truckers have come out against the point of obligation being moved. The railroads have come out against the point of obligation being moved. And so as a result, I think it's Donnybrook. I know we're developing policies on what we MBB think. I like this issue bubbling around because I view it as an opportunity to find new allies that want to help us, that we're willing to help them. And so the more they argue amongst themselves, they're going to need somebody to help them solve their problem. The more we can talk about how do we get growth for biodiesel. So anybody else?
I agree with all that and underscore the general thought that this is one of those areas where EPA and some of the other folks in the Trump administration will have an opportunity and some leeway to have an impact on the RFS while still remaining within the confines of President-elect Trump's pledge to support the program.
Our next question is about foreign policy. How do you expect foreign relations to be affected under President Trump, especially with China and the export of soybeans?
Well, that is certainly a very major concern for a lot of the biodiesel stakeholders that are in the soybean side of the industry. Over half of the soybean crop now is exported. The majority of that goes to China. It has been the source of the growth in the soybean industry over the last decade. We're endeavoring to make sure that the administration understands the benefits of trade, that this is a success story, that it has tremendous economic benefit and value to this country. We are pleased with the nominee to head up the U.S. TR, Bob Lighthizer. He's somebody who has a lot of experience and knows these issues. But there is certainly the potential that there's the domino effect and soybeans and imports of soybeans into China would be at the top of their list for retaliatory targets if they were unhappy with other things that this administration took on in terms of trade and monetary policy and things like that. But time will tell. You balance that with the fact that China has a lot of people that they have to feed. They don't want to be dependent on sole sourcing their feed needs and the U.S., Brazil, and Argentina are the only places for them to get the soybean meal that they need. And again, they don't want to be dependent, and particularly with Brazil and Argentina and the issues that they have on being reliable suppliers sometimes, and weather issues. So, there's a reason that they bring a lot of soybeans from the U.S., and those still exist. So hopefully we'll do a good job of making them aware of the benefits, and we won't get to any heightened emergencies or controversies with the Chinese.
In the past 15 years, we've had a $3.5 trillion trade deficit with China. $3.5 trillion. So that should put incredibly increasing pressure on U.S. exports to China to try to make this trade more mutually beneficial than it now is. But I serve on a U.S.-China Economic and Security Commission, and we've spent a lot of time studying President Xi to try to understand what this leader in China is about. We'll now probably spend some time studying what President Trump is about in terms of China. The issue of one China can't be overstated. To the Chinese, it's critically important. And so we'll just have to watch and see how this develops. Some of what President-elect Trump has said, I think, is for negotiating purposes and posturing purposes. My hope is that he and President Xi of China develop a good relationship, and that we have some more robust export opportunities from the United States so that we have a more mutually beneficial trade relationship with China.
Well, Senator Dorgan, we have one for you specifically. Senator Heidi Heitkamp seemed to have great chemistry with the Ag Secretary during the Ag Secretary interviews. Any thoughts on why she didn't take it? Wouldn't she have been a good pick for our industry?
She would have.
Well, Heidi would be a good agriculture secretary. I don't know that she'd want to wake up in the mornings thinking that maybe Donald Trump could fire her. That's always the problem with somebody who is of the other party. But Heidi did what I would have done and anyone would have done. When invited to Trump Tower to talk to the president-elect, she went up and had an hour and 15-minute meeting with him. I talked to her about the meeting, and it was fascinating. But she was not looking to serve in a cabinet. And, my belief is that Heidi Heitkamp is a terrific senator and does a really great job for a lot of things, especially rural interests. I believe she will run in 2018. She comes from a red state. I won 11 statewide elections in a red state. Many others have done the same. Heidi, I believe, will do the same. I think she'll be very successful in 2018. And I'm glad she'll remain in the Senate. We need her there. But I don't think it was ever in the cards that she was going to be a member of the Trump cabinet.
I think it was a lot of fun for folks to think about, though, and we're still playing the naming game. I checked my email and saw if there was a naming of a USDA secretary before we came on stage, and so far, not so much. So the waiting game continues, and hopefully we get a good folks that we can work with. Switching it up a little bit, this is a transportation question. Regarding biodiesel feedstock and refined product movement within the U.S., should we realistically expect transportation infrastructure spending to increase, particularly for inland waterway structures under Trump?
I hope so. Really of the big three issues that this new Congress, the 115th session of Congress, you've heard about the Affordable Care Act, repeal and replace. You've heard about tax reform, and the third leg of that is infrastructure. And all of us from all across the country understand the need, whether it's roads, bridges, airports, and certainly for those of us in Missouri and other, even up your direction, the riverways, the locks and dams. I'm hopeful that after all, especially after we've discussed on the upper Mississippi, taking 600-foot locks that had a 50-year useful life, and that was about 70 years ago, turning those 600-foot locks into 1,200-foot locks to more efficiently move goods. I'm hopeful that the stars are lining up, if you will, to make some significant investment in infrastructure. Having said that, again, focusing on the Republican-led House of Representatives. I do not believe you're going to see $1 trillion out of our pockets, out of the federal treasury, going for infrastructure. There are some strong budget hawks still on Capitol Hill, which is good, keeping an eye out for our pocketbooks. And this would be a budget breaker. And so what are some innovative financing ideas? There's a lot of discussion about public-private partnerships, and that has been used successfully in some local areas, some of your states. Some of your governors have used these P3 projects in order to do infrastructure. The interesting additional challenge about bringing the private sector in, though, is there has to be a return on that investment to the private sector. And so how do you create this public-private partnership such that that the private entities who are putting up the money actually see somewhat of a return? The last point I would make is that this idea of public-private partnerships has been floated before by federal legislators, and the idea that the federal government could borrow more money from the private sector causes some to recoil. But ultimately, I think it's great news because, again, we're talking about jobs. We're talking about the transport of goods and services. You look at our competitors. Along with the headlines today of nominee Pruitt, tucked away was China's announcement that they're getting ready to make a $381 billion investment in renewables between now and 2020. And so while we're fighting and scratching and clawing for the tax reform and production tax credit and the RFS, one of our competitors has a blank check, in essence, as far as what they consider to be important in their energy field or in infrastructure. So I'm optimistic, again, glass half full. And so I really see infrastructure and hopefully, again, the inland waterway system, which, and other ports and roads and bridges and all of those things, I'm hopeful that, we're going to see a real infusion. And it really is a nonpartisan thing. I mean, this is, and Byron would agree, I think that, this is not a red-blue. When it comes to transportation, you've got some, this is one of the really least partisan discussions that are held, whether it's the Water Resources Bill, the WRDA bill, the Transportation Bill. You see, a lot of hand-holding in a good way of members working with each other in certain geographical regions and trying to make sure that we're doing the best thing to make our country great again. I can't believe I just said that.
I'm kind of speechless on that. Tim?
I just wanted to add that there's been talk over the last couple of years of funding a big federal infrastructure legislative package by taking tax revenues derived from a change in the tax law with regard to the treatment of billions and billions of dollars that U.S. multinationals are basically hiding overseas to protect that money from being taxed at the highest corporate rate. The money I'm talking about is owned by sort of Fortune 15 kind of companies that you're very well acquainted with. That proposal has been surfaced to be incorporated within a comprehensive tax reform package this year, i.e. the proposal is allow people to repatriate, quote unquote, this money at a lower tax rate than the corporate rate, and then take the revenues derived from that taxation and spend them however members define infrastructure for the purpose of the bill. Now, I'll tell you, Ann, though, this is a little bit tricky because, we talked about process as one of the 4 Ps. And, you can only, to some degree, only spend the same money once. The chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and the Speaker of the House, they would prefer to take that money, that quote-unquote repatriation money, and use it to lower rates. Others would rather let the rates come out a little bit higher in the end, but take that money and spend it on infrastructure. So I don't know if you've seen this, but some of the Trump transition officials have speculated on the idea of having two bills, having the comprehensive tax reform package move first and be enacted, and then subsequently have a separate infrastructure package. And the logic is that it appears that an infrastructure package could obtain bipartisan support in Congress, whereas it looks as if a comprehensive tax reform bill that lowers individual rates may not be able to attract bipartisan support. But the one caveat that I'll add, and I know others may have input, is that it's very unusual for the Congress to follow on the heels of one large tax reduction package with another tax reduction package. For those of you who are students of history, after the 1981 Reagan tax reduction bill, which was called IRTA, the next four bills were all tax increases, as Jim points out. So I think there's a lot of water to go under that bridge yet, to use a bad pun.
And I think I like Kenny's optimism. I do think that expectations are being and need to be tempered in terms of the likelihood of large infrastructure investment. There was a lot of talk early on. The $1 trillion number has been quoted very often. The question specifically referenced the waterways. We have two big challenges there. One is making sure, as members, if they do talk about a large infrastructure investment, that they include the waterways infrastructure. It often gets left out of the ultimate proposals and initiatives because it's not administered through the Transportation Department as the highway and bridges and other infrastructure in the country is. It's administered by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, has a separate funding process. So it's kind of the forgotten child sometimes. The second challenge, and Kenny referenced, as they back off the $1 trillion number in terms of direct federal dollars, as the competing interests using money revenues to make tax reform revenue neutral, the public-private partnership, while it works in some cases for roads in particular, because you have that ability for a return on investment through, through tolling, you don't have that same opportunity readily available for waterways. So for waterways infrastructure upgrades, it's much more a conversation of direct federal dollars, which is a more difficult conversation.
Well, we're starting to get a little bit short on time, and I'm so excited that you all have the benefit of hearing from my kitchen cabinet, because I call on these guys regularly to help us strategize at the NBB. So maybe all of you could leave us with some words of wisdom or optimism, or ways on which we can best approach the new administration, the new Congress, and some good words to live by.
Well, first of all, Ann, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thanks to all of you as well. My guess is that all of you would prefer that the destiny of your plant, your operation, your business would rest just with you on your site, and your guile, and your wit, and your capability, right? But regrettably, you, very much like farmers that need the Farm Bill, or the American Petroleum Institute that needs certain things with respect to drilling permits, and you have a need for good public policy to continue this growth in biodiesel. And even though we wish that weren't the case, it is the case, and that's why as a trade association, you have a Washington office, and this is not a commercial, I know this will embarrass Ann, but and I've seen a lot, and so as Kenny, as a member of Congress, I've seen a lot of trade associations and so on come into my office over 30 years, some good, some not so good, some really on top of things. This is really a big bang for the buck that biodiesel has. You've got great leadership in your Washington office. You've got a terrific group back in Missouri. You work together as producers, and you have to do that because this is a steep hill to climb, to get to know all the players and make sure they get the message of what it means back home. But boy, you have done a terrific job, and that's not by accident. It's through Ann's leadership and your leadership, And it's going to require, I think, an even steeper climb now for a bit while we try to understand exactly what's happening. What's the terrain in front of us? But you know what? You're up to it. This is, again, taking this magazine, this is a story we need to tell this new president. You want a winner? This is a winning industry. And it's a winning industry in the very part of the country that you and your campaign said you want to revitalize with jobs and opportunity. Here's the way to do it. This is a puzzle, right? This is the piece. Mr. President, this is the piece of that puzzle. Thank you very much.
And thankfully, we've got some good ag journalists and broadcasters that are going to help us tell our story. You know, something that Byron said just really struck a chord with me about, you know, if we could just focus on our businesses and what we do well. My first political lesson, much to the chagrin of my government high school teacher, my real first political lesson was in 1979 when the President of the United States decided to put an embargo on our wheat to Russia. And I didn't understand it really at the time. I wondered why my father spent a lot of time staring into poking the fire, you know, and he told me later, really toyed with the idea of maybe it was time not to farm anymore. And so it struck me, and continues to, that decisions that are made all the way across the country in the District of Columbia affect all of our lives and livelihoods. I'm still very optimistic. And because I see that you're here, and I see we have a packed hall, and I'm mindful of the fact, and just as a quick vignette, last August, a congresswoman from St. Louis agreed to come to Mexico, Missouri, and I don't want to embarrass Cliff Smith, but Cliff's the plant manager, and Donnell was there. And so Congresswoman Ann Wagner, now she knows which end of a cow and a pig, you know, is the production side, you know, and I mean, but we brought her to the biodiesel plant in Mexico, Missouri, and she gave us an afternoon. And at the end of this, and we weren't sure how the response was going to be. We didn't have a hard ask, although we were prepared, weren't we, Donnell? To, you know, we need your support for the tax credit. But in Mexico, Missouri, the biodiesel plant is the reason why Mexico, Missouri continues to be a small community in this middle part of Missouri. And she grasped that like that and said, you know, if it weren't for what you're doing, this town would cease to, I mean, it would dry up and blow away, in essence. So this is very much, I mean, again, it's a story that you tell, we tell on your behalf. We have to continue to evangelize. You know, the policy, and boy, it gets complicated and convoluted, and the politics and things that we don't have control over. What you and I and all of us do control is a group of legislators that are willing to run through that wall for us, who are willing to speak up in that back room when the sausage is being made, to say, wait a minute. We've got to make sure that this industry continues to be strong, viable, and growing. I am optimistic. We do have challenges. And though, with the team that's here, thank you for letting us, on your behalf, fight for you like the industry depends upon it, because, candidly, it does. Thank you.
Boy, it's hard to follow those two speakers.
I hate following members. Okay?
The only thing I'll say is that, you know, I've been doing a lot of meetings with a lot of company CFOs and tax directors around the country as an official with Ernst & Young. And the one kind of reaction I get commonly from a lot of these people is always, they say, oh, you know, I'm not sure that we could actually really affect the national debate, that we're just little old us, you know, we're not GE or Microsoft or something like that. And, I think a lot of what the depiction we see in the media kind of reinforces the idea that really the way federal policy is made is a couple of older, white men in some club somewhere smoking cigars and drinking scotch, cut some sort of a deal, and that's really, it's really an oligarchy. But the good news is really that's never been the NBB style. We've always been a populist, grassroots, from the ground up group, bunch of, men and women, who are familiar with the day-to-day operations, employing in the states and districts. We've always had a style of being very close to those local elected officials, members and senators, and I think that could potentially all be cause for optimism because, every Congress, every presidency, there are themes. We're going to put the first man on the moon. We're going to accomplish social justice. We're going to reduce carbon. And I think those things are all meritorious, so don't get me wrong. But I think that with regard to this president and this Congress, I think what you're going to find as a goal that is higher than all those is going to be, economic activity, domestic employment, trying to raise, everyone's boats. And in many of the rural states and districts that biodiesel is located in, we may be one of the biggest employers. We may have one of the biggest supply chains. You may be, to a certain degree, one of the largest, dynamics that affects whether or not, employment is good, people have jobs, et cetera. So rather than insinuate to you that somehow that, Ann and Tom and the other NBB officials are going to go into some smoke-filled room and drink scotch and do a secret deal to get the NBB tax credit extended or elaborated, I think really we are dependent upon you guys to keep doing what you do in terms of having those grassroots relationships. And with that,
Thank you. And I totally agree with what my colleagues have said. Let me be optimistic from this perspective. I believe the president-elect is truly a businessman, and I think he's a man who listens. And if you want an example, I'll use repeal the Affordable Care Act. So the last 2 weeks has been very quickly moving through its paces to be repealed in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate. And somebody got to the president and pointed out to him that if you repeal the financial underpinnings of the Affordable Care Act, you blow up the entire health insurance market in the United States. And what did the president do? Whoever got a hold of him, the president decided over the last weekend to tweet that he wanted to associate with repeal with reform immediately instead of doing them in 2 steps. Why I tell you that story is that I believe he's a man that can be educated. He's a man that listens and understands the business of practicality. We're an industry that matches up very perfectly with his perspective on rural economy, on jobs. And I think we probably have a really good chance of working with this president and working with his administration.
I guess I would leave with the thought that there are no absolute truths. When it comes to Washington policy, it's a complex system. What's true for one issue may not be true for the next issue. What's true for 1 year may not be true for the next. If you're a sports fan and a football fan, you've heard the conventional wisdom in the NFL that it's a quarterback-driven league, and that's the winning teams are the ones with the best quarterbacks. Well, the Denver Broncos won the Super Bowl last year based on the strength of their defense. So then the old conventional wisdom came back in vogue that defense wins championships, and the 4 teams left standing right now are all about offense. So it's there are no absolute truths.
And when I talked about leadership, I didn't see Donnell back there, but Donnell, thank you for your leadership as well. You all have a great team here, and a lot of leadership and a lot of space at Donnell. Thanks for what you do.
Well, thank you all so much. Hance, I appreciate you leaving us on a sports analogy. As often I am the only woman in the room, I am very familiar with every sports analogy now that we have out there. So it's appropriate that we leave on that note. Again, thank you all for coming. I'm going to just read quickly. The gift card winner for this session is Wes Swift of SP Global. Wes, are you still here? Going once, twice. Pamela Morris, Pamela, you have a $100 gift card. Please come see me. Thank you all again.
Thank you.
Good to be with you, Kenny, as always. Really nice job. Good.